E.M. Dubois, The Savior Libra, Part 1 of the Apocalypse Chronicles, copyright 2017. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Chapter 1. Associates. In the beginning, it was already the end. Once upon a time, in the harsh, cruel world, in the small, backwater town of Heberondale, Georgia, there lived a boy. And not just any boy either. He'd lived to endure the most terrible ordeal the Bible could ever wrongly foretell. He believed in many things that were completely wrong. He believed he had E.S.P. He was wrong. He believed it was God-given. He was wrong. He believed he could learn to control it. He was wrong. He believed he could live in harmony with it and the world around him. He was wrong. But this story didn't begin with him. It began on an airliner flying tens of thousands of miles above the state of Georgia, almost 14 years before the attack that would change the boy's life, and 1 week before he was born. Special Agent Ledoux was taking a commercial 747 flight to Athens to go see a very peculiar man who worked there. The plane was booked full of dreadfully normal citizens of the world, all of whom were flying for their own little business to carry out in their small, insignificant lives that nobody else on the airliner but themselves cared about. Ledoux smiled at the irony of it. People taking public transportation for private business. His own affair was certainly confidential and far more important than seeing some ailing, distant relative or going to a financial meeting to discuss what funds would be transferred to what sector of an expanding enterprise. S.A. Ledoux was a Northern Asian-looking man with pale skin and thread-like hair, which was black and cropped short, already starting to recede at the corners of his brow. His eyes, though little of them could be seen since they were hidden behind a pair of dire shades, were an unnatural and intimidating shade of red. He was normally in Washington, D.C., but he was being sent down in urgency to speak with Dr. Kenneth, a man who'd discovered a deep secret of a society that shouldn't have existed, but seemed to lie right under the world's skin. Just which department of the government Ledoux was an agent of was classified, but Kenneth was under the impression Ledoux was an investigator with the influence to do something about the sect he'd discovered. The special agent had been trusted in full confidence to gather the crucial information that the doctor had to show him and report back immediately. The uneventful trip was almost over. Ledoux sighed thankfully when the pilot came over the comm system and announced that they'd be landing in 10 minutes. So, to make sure their tray tables were in the upright and locked position, and strap on their seatbelts if they hadn't done so already. The trip had lasted a grueling hour and a half. Ledoux's own desire to fulfill his mission and the lack of autonomy drawing out the tip in his mind. And they'd been shown some movie he hadn't particularly cared for. Damn romantic comedies. Ledoux liked more to watch films with plenty of human death tolls and the hero miserably failing at his quest. Apocalyptic movies were his favorites. People working with him in his bureau often wondered why. The plane rocked a little, banking left in descent, and the stewardesses made their way to their seats, strapping themselves in as well. Ledoux braced himself into his seat, feeling a little discomfort in his back that wasn't due to the material. He looked out of the window and saw the grey of the tarmac reaching quite some ways out, surrounded by large glass and metal buildings and air traffic control towers. His ears detected a muffled, electric moaning sound. Nobody was paying attention to it, he knew, and he figured it was the landing gear moving into place. The plane continued to move down as the nose pitched, barely noticeably, upwards just before touchdown. The back wheels made contact a split second before the front, making the aircraft shudder and the passengers lurch slightly in their seats as the plane slowed down. A stewardess gave a reassuring smile to the people seated in front of her. Then, as the airliner came to an unexpected stop, she unbuckled herself and turned for the cockpit, rushing inside. She returned after a few moments and traveled down the aisle that separated the coach section in halves. As she did, the pilot came over the comm. "We regret to inform you that the terminal is down at the moment, so you'll have to depart via stairs," he said. Li Ju smiled. It was an obvious attempt by those working against him to delay his mission. Too bad. He was better prepared than they were. He was working toward an end, one eons in the making, and no millennia-old secret society would stand in his way. Being prepared meant knowing the contingencies of the world's complicated systems as well as his enemies did, if not better. He'd capitalize on a simple, rushed oversight on the part of his enemies, and in the long run, he'd make them pay dearly for it. The stewardess made her way to the hatch behind the cockpit, grabbing the handle and pulling the door open to let in the cool autumn air. She was in time to see a large truck, almost late, just finish pulling up the last few feet to the hatch. The truck was longer than it was tall and had a large set of stairs on the back. As it pulled up, the stairs were locked into place on the side of the airliner under the door. Li Ju's senses, despite him sitting in the rear of the coach section, caught every bit of the exchange with the clarity of the passengers sitting beside the door. The stewardess gave an annoyed look at the man standing at the top of the steps, who gave her a little grin. His face was young and covered in freckles. "You guys are pushing it," she warned. "Pushing the plane?" he joked. "I don't think this truck can do that." "You know what I mean," the stewardess shot back. She then turned to the occupants of the airliner and gave them a thin smile. "You may leave the plane now," she said. "Please check for your luggage in the carousels and have a fine day." She went on about thanking them for flying with them and such, not that any of the passengers were paying attention to her anymore. People began unstrapping themselves from their seats and moving into the aisle. S.A. Li Ju was one of the first to leave, an advantage of his seating placement, with no carry-ons to remove from the overhead compartments. The stewardess waved at him with a smile. He didn't even acknowledge the useless pile of flesh as he exited the metal bird and allowed the young man with freckles to continue his attempt at flirting with her. Rather pathetically, Li Ju noted. He moved down the stairs and crossed the landing zone to the atrium of the Ben Epps Airport. The sun lent little of its warmth to the world, not that Li Ju cared. His skin and suit, for reasons he wouldn't explain to anyone who asked, seemed to emit a heat all by themselves. It kept him and the air around him comfortably warm, and anything else that his flesh came in contact with. Li Ju covered the distance to the main lobby quickly, walking through the automatic sliding glass doors, a soft hiss the only sound of his unobserved entrance, as the other passengers waited at the carousels for their useless things, eager to grab them before anyone else had a chance to glance at them. Such behavior would make it easy to spot anyone watching him. All of them were in such a hurry to go absolutely nowhere, in a world that didn't have long left on its clock. Leju had a purpose, though. He'd studied his assignment in a briefing back in DC and kept everything he needed for the mission in his mind. He walked through the lobby of the airport, not looking around much, but taking everything in through his other senses. He was unimpressed by the architecture of the building. He'd seen many places like this. The ceiling was high and, except for a wireframe model of an early biplane, pretty empty. The walls, which were spaced out widely, were green all the way up to the ceiling, and there were rows of brown, soft-looking chairs for people to sit on as they waited for their planes to come in, which was exactly what some were doing. One family was even standing up, the father holding a sign with somebody's name spelled on it. Leju rolled his eyes. Blissful ignorance. If only these animals knew their true fate. The same type of sliding door was the exit to the airport. He approached them as they slid open for a couple and their child, who was peacefully sleeping in her mother's arms. Leju glanced at them as he passed by and gagged behind their backs. Very unspecial agent-like, but he still broke his professional demeanor to do it. There was a taxicab waiting just outside of the atrium's lobby doors, distinguishable from the rest by a paper in the passenger window with S.A. Leju sloppily written in marker. Leju walked up to it, not having to worry about a crowd since they were all still back at luggage claim. Cheap bastards, he cursed inwardly at the American government. If I worked for a corporation, I'd have a damn limousine. It was the classic mustard yellow with the white sign at the top. Leju's department had informed him he'd be picked up by a transport vehicle already waiting for him as soon as he landed, the fee already paid. All that was left to do was rendezvous with the driver and endure the ride to meet with Kenneth. Leju opened the rear passenger door and slid into the cab. For all he'd heard, the stereotypical view of the unclean taxi wasn't present here. The taxi driver, a middle-aged Caucasian man, looked back at him and raised an eyebrow. Leju was disappointed. Damn, no joke there. "You're Special Agent Leju," he answered. His voice was layered with a Slavic accent. The cabbie shrugged, not questioning any more. It was all he needed. He laid a hand on the wheel and shifted into gear, pulling out of the parking zone. They merged with the busy traffic of the street, and the taxi driver's foot turned to lead, burning gas and rubber. Leju resisted counting away the minutes as the cabbie drove him to Atlanta, keeping himself busy by repeating in his mind again and again the mission's briefing. The ride was smoother once they got onto the 10 and headed west, straight inland. Soon after, they were heading a little more south. Leju watched the scenery pass by through the window, the beautiful green grassland, all in a blur. They passed through a few cities, only slowing to prevent receiving a ticket. In Conyers, the cabbie turned onto I-20 and drove on, with the pedal to the metal, making a dent in the floor. S.A. Leju watched as they flew past a sign reading, "Welcome to Atlanta," along with the rest of traffic. The sun was still high in the sky. Leju gave the giant star a dark look from behind his shades and sat back from the window. They entered the metropolis outskirts, already encountering heavier traffic. The cabbie may have thought of slowing down, but it wasn't until they almost rear-ended another taxi that he acted on it. Leju just about strangled him. Death didn't scare him, but the thought of going back to hell with a mission incomplete didn't appeal much to him. They weaved through traffic as best as they could. The cabbie was pretty skilled at his job, though, as they advanced farther into the city, the streets became too congested to maintain a steady pace. Leju didn't have to keep glancing at the digital clock set in the dashboard to see that it wasn't even rush hour yet. Vehicles of all shapes, sizes, and colors lined up one after another in every lane, the drivers sounding off their horns angrily at each other and flipping the bird in every direction, at traffic lights and each other. Leju stared at the driver, who rolled down his window, stuck out his head, and yelled obscenities at a man behind the wheel of a minivan 2 feet in front of him. The agent tapped a finger impatiently on his thigh, shifting uncomfortably again, feeling something spasm deep in his back. His eye twitched behind his shades, and he resisted the urge to smack the cabbie as he pulled his head back into the vehicle, presenting his finger to everyone in sight. "If we get run off the road," Leju cautioned, "I'll let them get you. Hell, I'll hold you down." "Fine, fucker," he retorted. Under his breath, which he thought Leju couldn't hear but did, he said, "Damn Russians." Leju bit his lip, hoping the ride wouldn't last much longer. The meeting place was supposed to be a public establishment chosen at the last moment possible. Anywhere else could be bugged. He didn't even trust a government-appointed rendezvous point. But he had to grin at the stupidity of his department's paranoia as it fed on itself, fueling their mistakes. Most level-headed people would have realized that the latter was their best choice. Public establishments could be easily observed. He counted on that. Someone in the Pentagon had asked, "What the hell were they thinking?" Leju made sure she was permanently and brutally silenced. Maybe he should have been a little more cautious when forging that part of the documents. Oh well. Finally, the halted traffic began to crawl along again. Leju was tempted to stick his own head out the window to see what was taking them so long. Instead, he buried his impatience by thinking about what kind of information he needed to gather from Kenneth. He wasn't worried about missing the meeting, though. Leju knew Kenneth would wait for him no matter how long it took him to get there. He remembered the report that had contained the details of the rendezvous. The meeting was at a very specific cafe that he'd made sure to leak to only a few specific people. Ones he knew would accidentally let it out, so the people he really wanted would know to be there. The cabbie had been notified of the establishment's address, so Leju wouldn't have to repeat it. They passed the cause of the congestion far into the city, and they weren't even in the center of the financial district yet. There'd been an accident. 2 ambulances were already pulling away from the site, leaving a scene of carnage behind. 7 vehicles were smashed and twisted together, with debris scattered over the pavement and sidewalk. The scene was surrounded by police cars that blocked off 2 of the 4 lanes of the right-side traffic. Officers directed the flow around the scene or diverted it to other streets altogether. As they drove by, Leju spotted a crimson-stained arm hanging from a smashed-out window and a red-stained white blanket being pulled over the face of a child lying on the sidewalk. From the look of the flattened blanket and pool of blood around him, most of his bottom half must have been missing. Leju couldn't suppress a smile. It was partly at the loss of human life. The other part was him wondering if this had been his adversary's work. Would they truly have the fortitude to stoop so low just to make sure he wouldn't reach his destination on time? Why didn't they just attack the cab itself and be done with it? Surely one of their agents could work discreetly enough in broad daylight. Maybe they were afraid their men wouldn't be skilled enough to take him on without creating a scene that'd expose their order. It had been almost 1,000 years since they dealt with Leju's kind in the flesh, after all. But there was a far more worrying possibility to think about. They might have been buying time to take Kenneth for themselves. The thought made Leju slightly uncomfortable. It'd be a great loss, one he wouldn't be able to make up for. Once again, the cabbie tried to resume his usual speed, but the streets were just as clogged up as before, so he was forced to keep his foot light on the pedal. They drove through Atlanta, taking routes around the busiest parts of the city instead of through them. They entered a different district, moving along streets pressed on both sides by eateries. At last, the cafe they were searching for appeared, nestled between stores. The cabbie twisted the steering wheel to the right with one hand, the rim of a tire scraping slightly against the concrete curb. Liju looked out the window and grinned at the cafe, just the sight he wanted to see right now. The entrance was just across the sidewalk. A light throng of people crossed his vision, but he could still see how busy it was inside. There were just enough people to hide among, not that he wanted to. The people he knew would be watching sure would. He opened the door and stepped out of the cab, slamming it shut behind him. The taxi's wheels squealed as it jerked back into traffic, cutting off another motorist as he jumped into the flow of cars. Liju admired the little cafe from where he stood. Such a small place, serving the role of an important rendezvous point. The owner should be proud. It was squat compared to the buildings on either side of it, but the inside stretched deep in front of him. Tall windows allowed customers to see both in and out of it. It was fairly busy inside, full of college students studying and sipping drinks, and businessmen on their lunch or working away from the office. Pedestrians nudged politely past Liju as they made their way by. He paid them no mind. There were more pressing matters at hand. Liju felt he was being keenly watched, the second thing he wanted to see. He maintained the grin, not turning his head as his eyes shifted to his right under his shades. From outside the cafe, he could see Keith, who hadn't noticed him yet. Liju's eyes merely glanced over him as they searched for the culprit. The special agent found him easily. The person didn't blend in easily with the crowd inside. He had dyed black hair and colorful tattoos of blood and knives covering his arms. His face was full of piercings, including the lips pursed around his cigarette. Light from the window glinted on the end of a long knife he concealed under his collar, yet still managed to contrast under the thin threads. His green eyes were homed in right on Liju as the occupant rhythmically sipped at his coffee. But something else was odd about the eavesdropper. There was a powerful aura emitting from him, and it felt like it was focused right on Liju. Even through the dark lenses Liju wore, they locked eyes. So, the leak had worked to get their attention, Liju reflected. They'd sent someone to observe the transaction of information. They may work deeper than the government, but they still had their fears. Liju's eyes scanned back over the heads of the crowd until he found Dr. Keith again. What he took in was characteristic of a man routinely overworked by the government. Balding, with only half a head left of stringy hair, thin body eaten away by continual stress, overdressed in a suit that hung off his body, and wearing glasses. His complexion wasn't the best either, having spent more time over the last few years under artificial rather than natural light. Liju wouldn't be surprised if he found that the man smelled too. Keith was a man one dreadful day away from snapping all ties to reality. Liju also found a young man working behind the counter, taking orders, fidgeting as he did so. He kept checking his watch after each order, then looking at the door. Liju smiled. Poor thing, always checked the time after anyone talked to him. The target finally spotted Liju as he approached the door. He grew both visibly excited and sweaty. Liju nodded at Dr. Keith and walked inside, weaving past tables full of new adults writing papers, making his way straight for his target. He sat down at the table with a sigh, finally at his objective. The boy in black was no longer in his seat, having disappeared to report back to his superiors. Liju gave a nod at the fidgety man working behind the counter, who nodded back and ran into the back of the store. He wouldn't be returning for a while, or probably ever. The associates he was alerting behind the cafe were Liju's, and weren't particularly fond of humans, much like Liju. They'd make sure the snitch never made it back. Dr. Kenneth was a federal genius, more often referred to as a government nerd. He was sitting yardstick straight in his chair and had both hands placed on the table with his palms pressed down against the surface. A briefcase was supported against a leg of his chair. After years of diligent work, his time had come to share the, in his mind, crucial results of his research with the rest of the world. "I guess you're Special Agent Liju," he said, breaking the ice with no hint of an accent so prominent in those around him. Liju gave him a nod. "Hello, Dr. Kenneth. I trust you've been fully informed about why you came all this way?" Kenneth's eyes darted from Liju's face to the case. A waitress came by to take their orders, Kenneth looking at her with an uncalled-for distrust. Liju found it a bit amusing. She wasn't the one he had to worry about, that was for sure. She left just as quickly as she came, not expecting a tip from the weird guy in glasses at the table. Liju was sure Kenneth could expect her to spit in his coffee. He couldn't resist a peek at her hips from behind his shades, not even having to turn his head. "This job definitely has its perks," he observed. "I have." Liju put a hand on the tabletop, tapping it slowly. "Apparently, you have important information concerning something that my department back in D.C. is very interested in." "Right." Kenneth's fingers tapped on the tabletop as well, itching to write something. "I have documents and information collected over the last 3 years and—" "3 years?" Liju interrupted. "The study has been going on for the last 15, if I'm not mistaken. Ever since the McCarthy trials uncovered what appeared to be a sect within the government that wasn't Russian spies. Entire parts of the government with no purpose but are top secret, with a lot of power and funding being poured into them." "Well, yes," Dr. Kenneth answered, looking down at the table. "But I haven't been with the investigatory committee that long." "Fair enough. I was hired by the Pentagon to see where large amounts of funds were disappearing to within the executive branch. As it turned out, it's not just them, but many political parties are involved in funding projects for some very secretive people. I have names and activities all in my briefcase. Our own government hunts down very specific children for them and keeps close tabs on them until they're adults." "So, who are the men in the shadows pulling the strings?" Liju asked. "I couldn't find out for sure," Kenneth replied with a sigh. "The sect is very good at covering its tracks. There's nothing concrete. All evidence is circumstantial. It almost seems supernatural. Only the politicians they work with are sloppy enough to leave evidence. All I can find on the sect is that they're called the Society and work out of hidden places called houses. They seem to be quite powerful, too." "And that's why the government is wasting all this money on these silly research projects?" Liju asked with a chuckle, trying to appear skeptical. "Anyone being blackmailed into keeping quiet?" "A lot of us," Kenneth said sheepishly, looking away to his lap. "My research into the subject has been forcibly cancelled, along with the rest of my department." The society scared you into stopping and guessing. We made a deal with them. We stop our projects and they'd stop blowing up our facilities. You contacted them? Liju asked. That was genuinely surprising. Directly? Kenneth shook his head. We left a message at a center we thought they'd hit next. They left their reply when we weren't looking. Liju was a little disappointed. One hell of an arrangement. Now, why the fuck was I dragged down here? Because it seems to me you could have just told me all of this over the phone. Because it might have been tapped, Kenneth said. I saw one of their people here just as you walked in. No matter what, we're being watched. Liju nodded, pretending to just now realize what he was talking about. If this had taken place over the phone, he would have taken every measure to ensure the line was tapped. Now, as far as the children go, I have some figures about how many of them are born each year, Kenneth went on, getting sweaty again in his excitement. What this society does with them, though, I have no idea. But my previous sources were able to fill me in that the society might be training these kids into some kind of weapons. They could strike even here in our own country, and nobody would be any wiser. Keep your voice down, idiot, Liju hissed. He looked around to see if anyone's attention had been drawn before continuing. Has anyone on your team actually observed this? Kenneth nodded. Dr. Rawson did before he was... He trailed off, then drew a line across his neck with a finger. Liju leaned back in his chair. I see. He was able to find one of these houses, Kenneth said. Like I said, it's all in the briefcase. Liju rubbed his chin with a thumb. So, we have a definite location. We can use it to get some real answers. But the president is making those acts illegal. He's passing hidden executive orders that are tying everyone's hands. Even so much as meeting one of these guys is a felony. You leave that to us, Liju said with a dismissive wave of his hand. He isn't tying everyone's hands, not mine. Now, I assume whatever else is in that briefcase is meant for me? Kenneth nodded. It all is. He reached down and picked up the briefcase, setting it on the table and undoing the locks. He flipped up the lip and began fumbling through it. This is what I really want you to see. These charts show two things, he said as he brought out 2 sheets of paper. This information had better be good, Liju interrupted. Oh, sir, it is. Trust me. Kenneth handed over the sheets to Liju and smiled broadly as the special agent looked them over a few times. They were meticulously labeled and organized. One had a chart labeled E.S.P. CC, born 1970 to 1983. It had a line graph on it that skirted the bottom of the horizontal axis, only to suddenly spike in the last year represented, going right back down to 0 again. The second was a line graph as well. Its slope was constant until the middle of the page, and then there was a sharp spike, but then sloped back down. It was labeled Rifts Opened, 1970 to 1983. Liju raised an eyebrow. Exactly what am I looking at? The first one shows the number of ESP-capable children born in the last 13 years, Kenneth explained. At least, that's what the agencies involved call them. These kids are the ones they're after. All right, but this graph's already complete. Exactly. We were able to conduct these studies before the society had gotten a chance to stop us. These would be the kind of children they look for. So, if the research is already complete, Liju worked out, the children have either been born or accounted for by the society. He put down the first sheet and looked at the second one. And this one? It tells you the number of rift portals that have been opened in the same time span. Kenneth reached over and tapped the line where it spiked. It was quiet for a while, and then suddenly they all began opening at once for a period of a year. Then nothing again. Rift portals? Now Leju was getting somewhere. He feared Kenneth had gotten there as well, though. They show up every time the number of children begins to increase, Kenneth explained. He patted the briefcase. There are more charts in here to illustrate it, comprised of birth records and supernatural reportings. Just before the number of these children will increase to a certain point, the number of these portals will skyrocket. Then they'll vanish for about a decade, then start opening again. After a long while, the cycle will start over. That part's not on the graph because, well, it hasn't been 10 years yet. I'm glad you noticed that, Leju muttered. So am I, but do you know what this means? He did. It meant someone was preparing Earth for war on a cosmic level. The Covenant was being rebuilt. But Leju had to know what the government thought of it as well. Frankly, no. Enlighten me. It means that the number of portals that can be opened coincide directly with the number of sensitive children born. Almost no children, lots of portals, and vice versa. The power seems to be focusing into the children as they dwindle down. And something is crossing over to meet them. Kenneth had spoken a bit too loud, attracting the attention of a few patrons of the cafe. Leju gave them all looks that made each feel uncomfortable and go back to their work. Then he reached over and smacked Kenneth upside the head. "Shut up!" he scolded from behind clenched teeth. "Now continue softly." A few of the portals pop up in the same places multiple times, establishing a predictable pattern, Kenneth said, his voice quieter as he rubbed the sore spot. One of those was in this state. Well, that's convenient. When will it next open up? From what the research has shown us, these portals appear not only when these children are born, but also about 1 decade after, when the children are likely taken to them. So, since the last spike was almost a generation ago, we should be seeing them getting active soon. And do you have the location of these children? Now Leju knew he was getting to the true information he hungered for. Just one, Kenneth answered. It's part of a report I wrote, also in my briefcase. He's projected to be born under the zodiac's Libra sign, though I don't know what significance that has. His family's somewhere in Heberendale. And there was the gold nugget. Does anybody else know of this? Leju prodded. Who else did you tell? Kenneth grew defensive. Nobody. The report's not finished yet, and I want more solid information before blowing the whistle. I was nervous even meeting with you. Then you must have much to do, Leju said. I know I do. This meeting is over. I want to see the report when it's complete. All right then, Kenneth agreed, getting up from his chair. I'll see you sometime soon, I think. Whenever I can contact you, I guess. I should have more for you by then. Oh no, Leju disagreed silently. You've given me all I need. Kenneth picked up his jacket and packed up his briefcase. He walked to the door, but turned back when he realized Leju hadn't stood up from his seat. Aren't you leaving? He called. I'm still waiting for my coffee, Leju called back. Maybe I can use yours to attract a lady. I'll send you the bill. All right then, Kenneth said one final time with a nervous grin. Obviously, he'd never been much interested in any lady. He left, wearing the last smile he'd ever have. Leju smiled too, all deadly teeth. He, the deceiver, had done his job well. It was time for the rest of the team to do theirs. He spoke discreetly into the inside of his shirt's collar. There, hidden in the fold of the fabric against his neck, was a very small microphone. Information obtained, he reported. It's very pleasing. He took a pause for a moment. "He just left. Corner him, and you'll get what we need. Deceiver, out." He waited for a bit, feeling very pleased with himself. The evil smile faded to one of amusement. He could feel a new gaze settling on him. He looked across the cafe. A young woman, quite attractive at that, was eyeing him as she sat near the wall. He aimed a nod her way, whetting her interest enough to make her stand up and stroll over to his table. "Looks like lunch is serving herself," he thought. "Well, hello," Li Ju said smoothly as she sat down. The waitress finally arrived with 2 drinks, looking relieved that Kenneth had left. Li Ju slid 1 coffee to his guest. "My treat." Was outside, hurrying to his car. He was eager to get back to the research lab to do more tests and start looking for the calling cards for the next portal. It was worth risking the Society's wrath. Finally, the chance that had escaped him as a child had come back. He'd hoped, no, he'd known it would. Now was the chance to seize the day. He'd regretted it every day since hearing the first stories of the Society and saying, "There's no way something like that exists." Now, finally blowing this whistle could make his career. And the government was actually helping him do it, too. He felt his heart skitter all over his chest. He turned down a clean alleyway that led to the back of the cafe, where he'd parked his car. He really didn't want to be watched. He hugged his briefcase to his chest like his own child. The shadows moved silently behind him, following each step the whole way since he'd left the cafe. Approaching the driver's side, he loosened his grip on his case so he could fish his keys from his pocket. A shadow again moved behind him, catching his eye. He looked to see what was there. Nothing at all. He turned back around, pulling out his keys to unlock his door. He heard a whirl and something grabbed him by the neck, catching him off his guard. Instantly, his neck was numb, a slight touch of frost spreading across the surface of the skin. It thrust his head hard against the vehicle's frame, holding him there. His eyes locked, unable to blink, on the reflection of the freezing hand on the maroon paint. It was blue, and the flesh clung tightly to the bone. His eyes traced up to get a glance at his attacker. He saw 2 instead of 1. They stood tall behind him, clad in black robes that covered all but their hands, which were identically skeletal. They both were hooded, and darkness covered their faces that smoked out and disappeared quickly in the light of the sun. Who are you?" Kenneth asked, his heart almost stopping in his chest. "Unimportant," the figure with its hand around Kenneth's neck answered. Its voice was a rasp. "We are the messenger and the fetcher," the second figure answered, much to the first's annoyance. "I am the fetcher." "We need that case," the messenger said. "Give it to the fetcher." The fetcher held out its free hand expectantly. Its breath brushed the back of Kenneth's neck. His blood chilled, making his head hurt and his body shiver. His fingers went dead and loosened their grip on the case's handle, then failed altogether. It fell to the freezing ground. There was more movement behind him, and he watched the messenger pick it up and hand it to the fetcher. "Thank you," the messenger said. "Speak of this to no one. Investigate this, and you will find yourself dead. Farewell, or not." The fingers on his neck released their grip, and the figures were gone. They hadn't been men, Kenneth was sure of that. His hand shook, causing him to fumble with his keys as he once again tried to unlock the door and start his car. He drove erratically, almost killing a group of schoolchildren as they stood on the corner of a crosswalk. He crawled into bed as soon as he was home, a broken man. Nightmares haunted him all night and almost the entire next day. His colleagues became concerned about his sanity and sent him home only an hour after he'd arrived at work. He was institutionalized 6 days later, just before finding a way to take his life. He settled for gnawing his wrists open. It left quite a mess. Not too far away, there was a nice little house in Heberendale. Inside it was a young wife doing her best to make sure her house was as tidy as it could be. Just because her pregnancy was almost 9 months along didn't mean she was worthless, especially in her home, which she'd worked hard to make her own. Mame yawned and sat on the couch with a huff. She put a hand on her round belly and gave it a little rub. A slow smile spread across her face as she felt the little life, her second child, growing inside her. It responded to her touch, stirring in her womb. She reached over to the vacuum she'd been cleaning with and touched the handle lightly. It turned off instantly. The days had been growing harder on her, and she was finding herself tiring easier. All she wanted to do was vacuum the carpet in the living room before her husband came home. But even that little chore required lugging around a whopping 20-pound machine over 10 feet of floor to suck the dirt out of a carpet that seemed 10 miles long after only 5 minutes. If she wasn't careful, this was going to kill her. Her weakness, or condition, was only known to her husband and a few close friends spread across town. They were the only people she had enough faith in to tell. She wouldn't even tell her own son because she was afraid of what he'd think of her. She didn't want her first child to think of her as a monster that'd kill him as soon as she embraced him for a hug. "Enough work for today, huh, little guy?" Mame whispered, still rubbing her belly softly. She turned on the television across from her on the other side of the room. There was a jumble of commercials on, so she ignored it. Just a little background noise for her life and the life of her family, who'd soon have a new addition. A little brother for her already 3-year-old sleeping in a room at the end of the hall to her right. She sighed, feeling the energy seeping out of her limbs. "I wish I was normal," she thought, just as Lance Validoorce walked into the house through the front door. "Hi, honey," she said, her smile turning into a guilty grin as she saw him look at the vacuum. "Were you cleaning again, Mame?" he asked, rushing to her side on the couch. Worry was all over his face. "It's all right, Damien," Mame said. She hugged him close and gave him a slow kiss. As their lips touched, she felt a rush of energy flood her entire body. It wasn't long before they were interrupted. "Mummy," called a voice from down the hall. "Daddy's home." "I know, Jack," Mame called back as their son came running into the living room. "What are you doing up?" Damien asked. He reached out and picked up his son with strong arms, giving him a few bounces on his lap. Mame watched as Jack laughed and began babbling about things he'd seen in his sleep. She didn't even look at the television again as she stood up to admire the 2 men in her life, soon to be 3. "The top story of the day," the newscaster reported as the news came on without anyone to pay attention to it. "A cold draft has run through Upper Georgia, just missing Athens and the surrounding cities and towns. The cause of this is unknown." An independent research firm burned to the ground, killing everyone inside a day before its scheduled closing. No remains of any documents were salvageable, and all bodies were unidentifiable. A broken gas line was found in one of the lounges, along with some neglected extension cords leading to a printer. Foul play was immediately ruled out. In other news, a rash of disappearances has struck the state, all being government employees. Mamie caught the last part of the telecast and felt a sharp pain deep in her stomach where the baby was. Her knees almost buckled where she stood. She leaned on the vacuum for support, trying to hide her sudden weakness from the two loves of her life. The baby inside her was moving around, and she could feel his heart beating rapidly. He was scared for some reason. She sensed it. "What is it?" Mamie muttered in concern, though not for herself. She lifted a breast and caressed the space under it where she felt him kicking. "What are you trying to tell me, Lance?" "What's wrong, Mamie?" Damien asked, putting down Jack to make his way to her. "Nothing, dear," she answered, trying not to sound pained. Mamie gave her husband a quick kiss, which Jack made a face at, and started for their bedroom. She felt just a little short of exhausted and didn't want Damien to sense it. Even Jack would have been able to, and he was quick to point out when things were wrong. Mamie shuffled her way to their bed and laid down, wrapping herself in the comforters that she just smoothed out a few hours ago. "It's all right," she said to her belly as she drifted off. "It's all going to be all right." Mamie fell into a less than peaceful sleep with her hands on her belly, with dreams full of people being hurt and a dark figure laughing over them all, and of a boy, young and clad in black, as he stood alone, waiting for his chance to fight the dark figure. All the while, the baby inside Mamie wouldn't calm down until he too fell asleep. Far from the quiet little home, deep in another world, a man was walking on a path in the woods. He was young and his body fit. The hood of his worn cloak fell over his darting eyes. He knew the path by heart, yet everywhere his vision rested, he spotted changes that hadn't been there the day before. His worried pace had started out quick, but he began moving abnormally fast through the woods, even for his age. The dead and dying foliage was a thick blanket on the forest floor. He shuffled his bare feet not even an inch above the dirt, kicking up colorful leaves in his wake. The forest itself that he was in used to be beautiful all the time, even when the leaves fell. Even now, with all its yellows, oranges, and browns, it'd still be wonderful to look at by anyone who hadn't been there before. To him, there was something off about them. Their colors seemed dull. Then there were the trees themselves. Once so strong and tall like the man, they now stooped over each other, thinning and turning pale. For some terrible reason, the forest was quickly dying. There were no new saplings to take the sick trees' places either. It pained him so much to watch it happen. It didn't bode well for the world around him. As if following the forest's lead, the weather was becoming darker. Black clouds constantly passed over him in the night, blocking out the moonlight and keeping the seas from filling back up as they absorbed the rain but didn't let it fall again, selfishly hogging it for themselves. Water was beginning to grow scarce in rivers and lakes. The young man worried about the fishermen that helped feed the soldiers. If the army couldn't be fed because they refused to share their shortening supply of food, who'd defend them against the approaching evil? The world was changing in ways he couldn't stop. The air became a little colder every day. The 3 suns set sooner, and the nights felt hopelessly long. More of the stars were blocked out by the clouds. The evil approaching. It wasn't natural. He knew that for certain. Everyone knew it. Old villagers looked to the horizon with fear they'd never known before, their old bones and animals by their sides, telling them things were happening that their failing eyes missed. Hunters were talking in the forest. Wolves, the likes of which had never been seen, came and went without anyone to stop them. But not just wolves. Their own shadows watched them with sinister intentions, telling the wolves when to attack. Women and children disappeared nightly, only to turn up in the morning as piles of blood-crusted rags and broken bones licked clean. The young man halted. The air had become ice-cold, and a pain, sharp as a knife, stabbed him right in the chest over his heart. A great sense of dread, deep and almost unexplainable, crept into his mind. His skin buzzed with electricity as he watched his breath steam in front of his face. Something was there, in the forest, watching him. He couldn't sense where, but it was there. The few leaves left on the trees, hanging on for dear life, turned blue and black, losing their grip and falling away. The trees paled to a bone white, moving closer together and their branches entwining overhead. Some of the thinner branches rotted away and fell off altogether. Yes, the forest was dying, but not of anything natural. He could have easily dealt with that. The evil had done it. It was time to turn and get out. Things were about to get much worse for the entire world. This would only be the start of it. He cursed himself inwardly, grief in his clear eyes. What use was the power of the forest if it wasn't enough to defend it? He'd been a master shaman of the region since he'd become a man only 4 short years ago. Now, at 20, he no longer had any idea what to do to keep the villages around the White Woods safe. Falling to his knees, he knew what they needed. It definitely wasn't him. More Zodiac Guardians were required. He was afraid 12 wouldn't be enough for this. He wished that wasn't the way it was. He'd seen a few Zodiacs around, training in valleys and such, teaching humans how to control their power. He hoped deep inside that the battle wouldn't take place here. Let them fight and spill blood on Earth, not on his own world. The young shaman stood up with some effort. His body shook, and he had to use the carcass of a tree for support to turn himself around. He walked along as quickly as his legs would allow, taking him back to the entrance to the forest. The air grew warmer once more, so he no longer saw his breath, and he shivered less. Only one last thing could make him stop, which he did. Something twitched barely inside the left edge of his vision, hidden in the leaves at the foot of some dead trees. The shaman pulled back his hood and walked over to the edge of the path, hesitating for a moment before continuing. His features were smooth with youth, his eyes mature in the ways of the world. They'd lost their glint years before he'd become a master shaman. His hair was long and brown, his hairline even. Under his cloak, he was strapping, proof of his rigorous training to learn to thrive on his own in the wild. As he came closer to inspect what had caught his attention, he squinted and saw it was a hand. It was slender, the fingers long and thin. He bent his knees and lowered his own hands to the ground, brushing away some of the leaves and random loose feathers. He uncovered an entire arm, then something white, just past the shoulder. A lone arm here in the woods wasn't uncommon anymore, with all the attacks. But the rest? He looked around, taking another look at the trees. It couldn't have been roots. They weren't as white as what he saw in the leaves. He touched it with a finger and felt a soft fabric. He quickly wiped away more leaves and twigs. He was shocked. He might have just found someone missing from one of the nearby villages. He finished working and squatted by a woman buried face down under an inch of dead foliage, cold to the touch. She had to have been there a while. She wore a tattered, long white dress. It was flimsy and thin, almost showing the skin underneath. Under it, on her back, was some sort of deformity he couldn't make out through the fabric. He couldn't guess her age, but she looked older than he was. He rolled her over, careful not to agitate whatever was wrong with her back. The man briefly wondered how he'd missed her on his walk into the wood, the route he was on now the same, but reversed. He gazed sadly down at the woman's thin frame, thinking her dead. He wondered if a wolf had gotten her, or something far worse. At least this was one body he could return to a mourning family. His thoughts were interrupted. Had her clothes just moved? Had he mistaken some breeze he'd missed, lost in his guesses, for a sign of life? He watched her chest, and it rose slightly. He held his breath, waiting. Then it fell to rise again. She was breathing. Not much, but she was. The young man quickly slid his arms under her and attempted to pick her up. As he did, the years melted off her, making her easier to lift. She must have only been 14 now. He stood there and closed his eyes, searching for her essence and her identity. Nina. Her name was Nina. She was a gift from the white goddess herself, made in her image. The shaman turned back and left the forest, holding her close to him and feeling her body warm up again. Stepping out of the wood, which had seemed to grow denser, he stopped one last time to look up at the sky above the trees. The black clouds circled around the center of the forest, the ones swirling in the eye, massing into a thick ceiling and darkening to a deep shade of red. They twisted themselves into a funnel that reached down for the forest. Once in a while, a bolt of red lightning arced from cloud to cloud. The ground shook violently, making him stumble and almost lose his footing. Then rose a massive dome of bedrock in the center of the forest to meet the funnel. It stood as a physical monument of the darkness approaching. The shaman stared at the dome, then down at the girl, and lastly at the whole forest before him. "What's gone wrong with you, Cacaslidon?" he whispered to the world around him. "Why do you not protect us from this evil?" "Libra," came a faint voice from under his chin, where the girl's head rested against his chest. The shaman stared back down at her in surprise. "What?" The girl tilted back her head with some effort to look up at him. "The Libra will protect us." The shaman's gaze lifted forward to the world he wanted to protect so badly as she rested her head back against him. He turned around, walking down the path once more. "Please," he said finally to the world around him, "please send this boy soon." Little did he know the warrior was already on his way, but for now slept inside his mother. His name would be Lance Validoorce. Thank you for listening to this audio rendition of E.M. Dubois' The Savior Libra, Part 1 of the Apocalypse Chronicles. If you enjoyed listening to this story, and you have the sincerest hopes from the author that you did, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing.